Daddy, why don't I have a mommy like everyone else?
The question hit Dan Carter like a punch to the chest as he knelt beside his 8-year-old daughter Sophie in the elementary school auditorium. Around them, families clustered together after the spring concert, mothers adjusting costume pieces and fathers taking photos. The easy unity of complete families that made Dan acutely aware of what he and Sophie lacked. Sophie's auburn hair was still crowned with the flower headpiece from her performance as a daisy in the school's garden production, but her brown eyes held the kind of sadness that no 8-year-old should have to carry. Dan pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo and struggling to find words that could ease a pain he felt just as deeply. "It's not that you don't have a mommy, sweetheart. Your mommy just can't be here with us anymore, but she loves you more than all the stars in the sky." "I know," Sophie whispered, leaning into his embrace. "But Jenny's mummy helped her with her costume, and Marcus's mummy made cupcakes for everyone, and I just wished I had a mummy here too." Dan's throat tightened as he watched other families around them, seeing what Sophie saw: the easy collaboration between parents, the way mothers naturally smoothed children's hair, and fathers captured moments with cameras, the casual intimacy of partnerships that made raising children feel less overwhelming. For 2 years since his wife Rebecca had died in a car accident, Dan had been both mother and father to Sophie, attending every school event alone, handling every milestone without a partner to share the joy or divide the responsibility. Some days he felt like he was drowning in the magnitude of raising a child alone, but he'd learned to hide that exhaustion behind a competent smile that fooled everyone except himself. "Tell you what," Dan said, forcing lightness into his voice. "How about we stop for ice cream on the way home, and you can tell me all about the best parts of tonight's show?" Sophie managed a small smile, but Dan could see the loneliness lingering in her eyes as they gathered her backpack and headed toward the parking lot. In the car, she chattered about her performance and her friends' costumes, but Dan caught her glancing wistfully at families walking together toward their cars, complete units that made their family of 2 feel somehow insufficient. That night, after Sophie was finally asleep, Dan sat at his kitchen table staring at bills that seemed to multiply despite his careful budgeting. His salary as a senior marketing coordinator at Blackwell Communications was decent, but single parenthood came with expenses that 2-parent families shared: daycare costs, after-school programs, the babysitters he hired for evening work events that were increasingly important for his career advancement. Dan pulled out his phone, intending to update his calendar with the weekend soccer schedule, when his thumb accidentally brushed against Rebecca's name in his contacts. He'd kept her number for 2 years, unable to delete that final connection to the woman who'd been his partner in everything. Before he could stop himself, grief and exhaustion and the weight of Sophie's question overwhelmed his usual careful control. His fingers moved across the screen, typing words he'd never intended to send anywhere. "I miss you so much I can barely breathe some days." Sophie asked about not having a mommy tonight, and I didn't know what to say. I'm trying to be enough for her, but I feel like I'm failing every single day. I'm so tired and lonely and scared that I'm not giving her what she needs. I wish you were here to help me know what to do. Dan's vision blurred as he typed, the phone screen swimming through tears he'd held back all evening. Without thinking, without checking, consumed by the kind of exhaustion that made rational thought impossible, he hit send. The message went not to Rebecca's long disconnected number, but to the contact directly below it in his phone. Victoria Blackwell, his boss, the CEO of the company where he'd worked for 3 years, the woman known throughout the office as brilliant, demanding, and utterly professional. Victoria Blackwell, who arrived at work before anyone else and left after everyone had gone home. Victoria Blackwell, who ran client meetings with surgical precision and had never, in Dan's experience, shown any interest in the personal lives of her employees. Victoria Blackwell, who had just received the most private, vulnerable message Dan had ever written. Dan realized his mistake 30 seconds too late. The message showed as delivered, and the horror of what he'd accidentally shared with his boss hit him like ice water. He stared at his phone in disbelief, his heart racing as he processed the magnitude of his error. He'd just sent an emotional breakdown to the Ice Queen of Blackwell Communications, a woman who terrified new employees and conducted business with the kind of cold efficiency that had built her company's reputation. She would think he was unprofessional, unstable, completely inappropriate. She could fire him. She should fire him. Dan set his phone aside and buried his face in his hands, wondering if it was possible to die from embarrassment. Tomorrow he would have to face Victoria in meetings, pretend this catastrophic overshare had never happened, and hope she had the professional courtesy to ignore the message entirely. What Dan didn't know was that Victoria Blackwell was sitting in her own kitchen at 11:47 p.m., staring at his message with tears streaming down her face. Victoria had built her reputation on control, on the kind of emotional distance that allowed her to make difficult business decisions without being swayed by personal feelings. At 38, she was one of the youngest CEOs in the marketing industry, a success story that magazines loved to profile and competitors loved to hate. What those articles never mentioned was the cost of that success, the complete isolation, the sacrifice of personal relationships for professional advancement, the way she'd learned to armor herself against any vulnerability that might be perceived as weakness in the corporate world. She'd been married once, to James Blackwell, a military officer who'd been killed in Afghanistan 4 years earlier. His death had nearly destroyed her, but she'd channeled that grief into work, building Blackwell Communications into one of the most respected agencies on the West Coast, while carefully ensuring that no one saw the broken woman behind the professional facade. Victoria had no close friends, no family nearby, no life outside the office that provided meaning or connection. She worked 16-hour days because the alternative was going home to an empty apartment that echoed with loneliness she'd trained herself not to acknowledge. Reading Dan's accidental message felt like looking through a window into the kind of authentic emotion she'd spent 4 years avoiding. Here was raw grief, honest fear, the vulnerability of a parent trying to do right by his child while struggling with loss that mirrored her own hidden pain. Dan Carter. She knew him as a talented designer who never missed deadlines, who handled client challenges with creativity and grace, who'd never given her reason to question his professional competence. She'd noticed he never attended office happy hours, never participated in workplace social events, but she'd assumed he simply preferred to maintain boundaries between work and personal life. Now she understood that he was protecting the same kind of wounds she carried, navigating grief while maintaining the appearance of competent functionality that professional life demanded. Victoria read his message 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of pain that resonated with her own carefully buried emotions. A widowed father raising his daughter alone, questioning whether he was enough, missing his partner with the kind of desperate intensity that Victoria recognized from her own darkest nights. She should ignore this. She should pretend the message never happened, maintain professional distance, protect both of them from the complications of personal connection in a workplace that demanded clear boundaries. Instead, Victoria found herself typing a response. Dan, I'm so sorry for your loss and for the pain you're carrying. Raising a child alone after losing a partner takes incredible strength, and from what I observe, you're doing a remarkable job. Sophie is lucky to have a father who cares so deeply about her well-being. If you ever need someone to talk to who understands loss, I'm here. Victoria stared at her own message, surprised by the words that had appeared on her screen. She'd revealed nothing specific about her own circumstances, but she'd offered something she'd never given any employee: genuine personal support. Before she could reconsider, she sent the message. Dan's phone buzzed at 12:03 a.m. He'd been lying awake, staring at the ceiling, and planning how to handle the inevitable awkwardness of Monday morning, when Victoria's response appeared. He read it twice, hardly believing that the Ice Queen had not only responded with kindness, but had hinted at understanding loss from personal experience. The relief was overwhelming. She wasn't angry, wasn't planning to fire him, had somehow found compassion for his accidentally shared vulnerability. "Thank you," he typed back. "That means more than you could possibly know. I'm mortified that I sent that to you by mistake, but grateful you responded with such kindness." Victoria's response came quickly. "Don't be embarrassed. We all carry more than others see. Take care of yourself and Sophie." The brief exchange ended there, but something had shifted between them. Victoria fell asleep thinking about single parenthood and the courage it took to show up for a child's needs while nursing private grief. Dan slept better than he had in weeks, comforted by the unexpected connection with someone who'd offered understanding instead of judgment. Saturday morning brought the kind of Seattle drizzle that made indoor activities seem appealing. Dan was attempting to help Sophie with a science project about the solar system when their doorbell rang at 9:30 a.m. He opened the door to find Victoria Blackwell standing on his front porch, looking nothing like the intimidating CEO who commanded boardrooms with icy precision. She wore jeans and a soft cream sweater, her blonde hair loose around her shoulders instead of pulled back in its usual severe chignon, and she was holding 2 coffee cups from the local coffee shop. "I brought coffee," she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it at work. "And I was hoping to meet Sophie, and maybe help with whatever project has you both looking so frustrated through your front window." Dan stared at her, processing the surreal image of his boss standing casually on his doorstep on a Saturday morning, looking younger and more approachable than he'd thought possible. "You came here," he said, still not quite believing it. "I did?" Victoria said, a hint of uncertainty creeping into her voice. "If this is inappropriate, I can leave. I just thought you might need a friend today, and I have a PhD in astrophysics that's been gathering dust for 15 years. Before Dan could respond, Sophie appeared behind him, curious about the visitor. She looked up at Victoria with the frank assessment of an 8-year-old, taking in the blonde hair and kind eyes and coffee offerings. "Are you here to help with my Saturn project?" Sophie asked hopefully. "Because Daddy's been trying to make the rings stay up for like an hour and they keep falling down." Victoria smiled, and the expression transformed her entire face from professionally intimidating to genuinely warm. "I would love to help with your Saturn project. I used to study planets for a living, so I might know a few tricks about ring construction." Within minutes, Victoria was sitting cross-legged on Dan's living room floor, showing Sophie how to use wire and cotton balls to create stable planetary rings while explaining the actual composition of Saturn's ring system with enthusiasm that had Sophie completely captivated. "This is so much better than what Daddy was trying to do," Sophie declared, carefully positioning cotton balls along the wire framework Victoria had demonstrated. Dan watched from the kitchen doorway, marveling at the transformation in both his boss and his daughter. Victoria was patient and encouraging, treating Sophie's questions with the same seriousness she brought to million-dollar client presentations. Sophie was more animated than he'd seen her since Rebecca's death, lighting up under the attention of someone who clearly knew far more about space than her elementary school textbooks covered. "I can't believe you actually came here," Dan said when Victoria joined him in the kitchen for fresh coffee. Victoria's professional mask flickered back into place for a moment. "Was it wrong of me? I know it's unusual, but your message last night—" She paused, struggling with vulnerability that came naturally in work settings. I understood the loneliness you described. I thought maybe you could use some practical support instead of just sympathy. Dan studied her face, seeing past the carefully maintained composure to something that looked like hope. When was the last time you spent a Saturday morning helping with someone's homework? Victoria was quiet for a long moment. I can't remember, she admitted. When was the last time someone needed my help with something that actually mattered? The honesty in her voice made Dan's chest tighten with recognition. They were both isolated in different ways, both going through the motions of successful lives while missing the connections that made those successes meaningful. Well, Dan said gently, Sophie definitely needs help finishing that project, and I'm pretty sure she'd adopt you permanently if you're willing to explain how Jupiter's moons work. Victoria's smile was radiant. I'd like that. I'd like that very much. They spent the morning working on Sophie's solar system model, with Victoria patiently explaining planetary characteristics, while Dan contributed artistic skills to painting and construction. For the first time since Rebecca's death, Dan felt like they were functioning as a team, with someone else naturally sharing the load of parenting responsibilities. Sophie basked in the attention of two adults focused entirely on her project, asking increasingly complex questions about space exploration and gravitational forces that Victoria answered with obvious delight. By lunchtime, they'd created a solar system model that was definitely going to impress Sophie's teacher, and more importantly, they'd created something else, the tentative beginning of an unlikely friendship. Would you like to stay for lunch? Dan asked as they cleaned up construction materials. It's just grilled cheese sandwiches, but Sophie makes excellent chocolate milk to go with them. Victoria hesitated, clearly torn between professional caution and personal desire. I should probably go. This is already more personal involvement than I typically allow myself with employees. But you're not just my boss today, Dan said quietly. Today you're Sophie's friend who knows about planets, and my friend who understood why I needed help. If you want to stay just for lunch, that would be nice. Victoria looked at Sophie, who was carefully arranging her completed project for optimal display, her face bright with accomplishment and joy. Just for lunch, Victoria said finally. But I make the chocolate milk. Sophie's technique probably needs some improvement. Lunch was everything Dan had forgotten family meals could be. Easy conversation, laughter, the comfortable chaos of a child chattering about everything and nothing while adults listened with genuine interest. Victoria seemed to relax completely, asking Sophie about school and friends and favorite books with the kind of attention that made an 8-year-old feel genuinely heard. Miss Victoria, Sophie said as they finished eating, do you have any kids? Victoria's expression flickered with something painful. No, sweetheart, I don't have children. Why not? Sophie asked with childhood's innocent directness. Dan started to intervene, but Victoria answered honestly. I was married once, but my husband died before we had children. After that, I was too sad for a long time to think about families. Sophie considered this seriously. That's really sad. But you're good with kids. You should get some. Victoria laughed despite the tears threatening her composure. It's not quite that simple, but thank you for the recommendation. You could borrow me sometimes. Sophie offered generously. If you want to practice being a mum, Daddy says I'm very good at helping people practice things. The generous offer made Victoria's throat tighten with emotion. She looked at this confident, loving child who'd just offered to share herself with someone she'd known for 3 hours, and felt something crack open in her chest. That's the nicest offer anyone has ever made me, Victoria said quietly. I would be honored to practice with you. As Victoria prepared to leave that afternoon, Sophie hugged her goodbye with the uninhibited affection of childhood, and Dan felt something shift in his understanding of his life's possibilities. Thank you, he said quietly as Victoria gathered her purse. for coming, for helping, for being exactly what we needed today. Thank you for letting me stay. Victoria replied, I haven't felt this useful or this happy in years. As Victoria drove away from Dan's modest house, she felt like she was leaving something precious behind. The afternoon had reminded her of what she'd sacrificed for professional success, the simple joy of being needed, of contributing to someone's daily happiness, of connecting with people who saw her as more than just her job title. She'd forgotten what it felt like to be valued for kindness rather than competence, to spend time without agenda or deadline, to be part of something that mattered more than quarterly profits. That night, as Dan tucked Sophie into bed, his daughter's enthusiasm about their day bubbled over into planning. Daddy, can Miss Victoria come back next weekend? She knows so much cool stuff, and she didn't get upset when I spilled chocolate milk on her sweater. Maybe, sweetheart. But remember, Miss Victoria is very busy with her work, but she said she liked practicing being a mum with me. And you smiled more today than you have in forever. Sophie's observation hit Dan with unexpected force. He had smiled more that day, had felt lighter and more hopeful than he'd felt since Rebecca's death. Victoria's presence had created something he'd forgotten was possible, the sense that he wasn't carrying every responsibility alone. We'll see what happens, he told Sophie. But today was pretty special, wasn't it? The best Saturday ever, Sophie declared with 8-year-old certainty. Miss Victoria is magic. Before we continue, please tell us where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel. Part 2. Walls Come Down. Sunday morning arrived with the typical chaos of single parenthood. Sophie's soccer game at 10 a.m., grocery shopping that couldn't be postponed any longer, and the mountain of laundry that had somehow multiplied overnight. Dan was rushing to pack snacks and water bottles when his phone buzzed with a text message. Victoria, good morning. I hope Sophie's Saturn project gets the A+ it deserves tomorrow. Thank you again for yesterday. Dan smiled as he typed back. Thank you for making it possible. She's been telling everyone who will listen about her new friend who knows about space. Victoria's response came quickly. Would it be inappropriate if I asked how the soccer game goes? I've never been to a child's sporting event. Dan stared at his phone, processing the implications of his boss showing interest in his daughter's weekend activities. The professional part of his brain recognized the boundary crossing, but the lonely parent part appreciated someone caring about the small details that made up his life. She's playing at Miller Park at 10 if you're curious, he typed, then added quickly. No pressure. Just thought you might want to know. He didn't expect Victoria to actually show up, which is why he was shocked to see her standing near the sidelines 20 minutes into Sophie's game, wearing jeans and sneakers and looking slightly out of place among the other parents, but unmistakably present. Sophie spotted Victoria during halftime and waved enthusiastically, her face bright with delight that her new friend had come to watch her play. For the rest of the game, Sophie played with extra energy, clearly performing for her audience of 2. After the game, which Sophie's team won 3-2, Sophie ran straight to Victoria for a congratulatory hug that Victoria accepted with surprising naturalness. Did you see my goal in the second half? Sophie bubbled with excitement. I remembered what Coach Sarah taught us about aiming for the corners. I saw it, Victoria said warmly. It was an amazing goal. You're really talented. Dan approached them feeling grateful and slightly overwhelmed by Victoria's presence in their weekend routine. You came, he said simply. Victoria looked almost embarrassed. I hope that's okay. I was curious, and I didn't have any other plans. The admission that Victoria had no weekend plans struck Dan as profoundly sad. Here was a successful, intelligent woman spending Saturday mornings alone while he struggled to manage single parenthood. Maybe they could help each other in ways that went beyond professional support. We were going to grab lunch after this, Dan said carefully. Just burgers and fries. Nothing fancy. Would you like to join us? Victoria hesitated, the professional caution warring with personal desire that Dan was beginning to recognize as her default internal conflict. Please, Miss Victoria. Sophie chimed in. Daddy always lets me get milkshakes on game days, and you said you make the best chocolate milk, so you probably know about good milkshakes too. Victoria's resistance crumbled under Sophie's hopeful expression. Okay, she said, her smile genuine and unguarded. But I'm buying lunch as a celebration of your winning goal. The restaurant was a family-friendly place with checkered tablecloths and a menu that hadn't changed in 20 years. Victoria looked slightly out of place among the soccer families and crying toddlers, but she seemed determined to embrace the chaos rather than retreat from it. Sophie monopolized most of the conversation, regaling Victoria with detailed accounts of each play in the game and elaborate plans for improving her performance next week. Victoria listened with the kind of attention that made Sophie glow with importance, asking follow-up questions and offering encouragement with genuine enthusiasm. Watching them interact, Dan felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight since Rebecca's death. Sophie was responding to Victoria's attention like a flower to sunlight, and Victoria seemed to be rediscovering a side of herself that her professional life had buried. Miss Victoria, Sophie said seriously as they waited for dessert, can I ask you something personal? Of course, sweetheart. Were you married to a soldier like in the movies? Is that how your husband died? Dan tensed, ready to redirect Sophie's innocent but potentially painful question, but Victoria answered with quiet honesty. Yes, I was married to a soldier. His name was James, and he was very brave and kind. He died in Afghanistan 4 years ago, fighting to help people who needed protection. Sophie absorbed this information with 8-year-old solemnity. That's really brave, but really sad. Do you miss him? Every day, Victoria said simply. Just like your daddy misses your mummy. Do you think they know each other now? Sophie asked, her child's mind working to make sense of loss and memory. Like, do you think they're friends in heaven, or wherever people go when they die? Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. I think they would like each other very much. Your mummy sounds like she was an amazing mother, and James always said he wanted children someday. They probably would be friends. Sophie nodded with satisfaction, as if Victoria's answer had resolved something important in her understanding of the world. Then you're both alone like we are. That's kind of sad, but also kind of nice, because now we can all be together sometimes. The simple wisdom of the observation left both adults speechless for a moment. From Sophie's perspective, their shared losses created opportunity for shared healing, their individual loneliness combining into collective comfort. After lunch, they ended up at the park where Dan and Sophie usually spent Sunday afternoons. Victoria kicked off her sneakers and joined Sophie on the swings, laughing with genuine delight as Sophie challenged her to swing higher and jump farther. Dan sat on a bench watching Victoria discover the simple joy of playground equipment, marveling at the transformation from intimidating CEO to someone giggling with his daughter over who could swing highest. When did you last do this? Dan called out. Probably when I was Sophie's age. Victoria replied, pumping her legs to gain height on the swing. I'd forgotten how wonderful it feels to fly. Watching Victoria embrace childish pleasure with such obvious joy, Dan felt his perspective on their growing friendship shift into something more complex. This wasn't just professional courtesy or even simple friendship developing between them. Victoria was becoming important to Sophie in ways that went beyond occasional help with science projects. More concerning, Dan was beginning to look forward to Victoria's presence in ways that had nothing to do with parenting support and everything to do with the way she made him feel less alone in the world. As the afternoon wound down and they prepared to leave the park, Sophie made an announcement that surprised both adults. "Miss Victoria, you should come to dinner at Grandma Helen's house next Sunday. She makes the best roast chicken ever, and she's been wanting to meet you." Dan's heart stopped. Helen Morrison was Rebecca's mother, the woman who'd been his lifeline during the worst period of his grief, Sophie's primary grandmother figure and the keeper of Rebecca's memory in their family structure. "Sophie," Dan said quickly, "Miss Victoria is probably busy next Sunday." But Victoria was studying Sophie's hopeful face with an expression that looked like longing mixed with fear. "Who's Grandma Helen?" she asked gently. "She's my real grandma from my mummy who died," Sophie explained matter-of-factly. "She loves me and Daddy so much, and she makes really good food, and she tells the best stories about when my mummy was little like me." Victoria looked at Dan, clearly understanding the significance of the invitation and the complexity of meeting the woman who represented Rebecca's family. "That sounds lovely," Victoria said carefully, "but I think that's something special between you, your daddy, and Grandma Helen. I wouldn't want to intrude on family time, but Daddy's always sad after we visit Grandma Helen," Sophie said with 8-year-old perception that cut straight to the heart of things. "Maybe if you were there too, he wouldn't be so sad afterward." The observation hit Dan like a physical blow. He'd thought he was hiding his post-visit melancholy from Sophie, but apparently 8-year-olds were more perceptive than he'd given them credit for. "Sophie," Dan said gently, "Miss Victoria has her own life and her own plans. We can't just invite people to Grandma Helen's house without asking her first." "Actually," Helen's voice came from behind them, "I think it's a wonderful idea." They all turned to see Helen Morrison approaching across the park, her grey hair catching the afternoon light, and her face wearing the kind of knowing smile that suggested she'd been observing them for several minutes. "Helen," Dan said, feeling heat creep up his neck. "I didn't know you were here. I was visiting the Andersons just across the street and saw you all playing together." Helen's eyes moved from Dan to Victoria with the assessing gaze of someone who'd spent 68 years learning to read people. "You must be the Miss Victoria that Sophie has been telling me about all week." Victoria stood up from the swing, automatically smoothing her hair and straightening her clothes as she prepared to meet the woman who held such an important place in Dan and Sophie's life. "Mrs. Morrison," Victoria said, extending her hand with professional courtesy. "Sophie has told me so many wonderful things about you." Helen ignored the offered handshake and pulled Victoria into a warm hug that clearly surprised the younger woman. "And she's told me wonderful things about you. How you helped with her science project and came to her soccer game and know all about planets and stars." Victoria accepted the embrace with obvious emotion, and Dan realized this might be the first motherly hug she'd received since her own mother's death years earlier. "Please, call me Helen," the older woman said, stepping back to study Victoria's face with gentle eyes. "Anyone who makes Sophie this happy is family as far as I'm concerned." "Grandma Helen, can Miss Victoria really come to dinner next Sunday?" Sophie asked eagerly. "She doesn't have anywhere else to go, and you always make extra food anyway." Helen's eyes softened as she looked at Victoria, clearly seeing the loneliness that Dan had only recently discovered. "Of course she can come to dinner. In fact, I insist on it. It's been far too long since I've had another woman to cook for, and I have some stories about Sophie's mother that I think Victoria would enjoy hearing." The invitation was issued with such warmth and authority that Victoria couldn't possibly refuse without seeming ungracious. Dan watched her face cycle through surprise, gratitude, and a hint of panic as she realized she was about to be welcomed into the most sacred part of their family structure. "Thank you," Victoria said quietly. "I would be honored to join your family dinner." "Wonderful," Helen said, patting Victoria's arm with maternal affection. "Sunday at 4 o'clock. Dan knows the way, And don't bring anything except your appetite, and maybe some stories of your own to share. As Helen walked away after giving Sophie and Dan goodbye hugs, Victoria stood still in the park, looking slightly stunned. "That just happened," she said. "Helen has a way of making decisions for everyone." Dan explained, though his tone was fond rather than critical. "She basically adopted me after Rebecca died, and now apparently she's adopting you too." "How do you feel about that?" Victoria asked carefully. "About me having dinner with Rebecca's mother?" Dan considered the question seriously, surprised to realize that the idea didn't upset him as much as he'd expected. "I think Helen's right that it's time for our family dinners to include someone new," he said honestly, "and I think Rebecca would approve of you." That evening, after Sophie was in bed, Dan found himself on the phone with Helen, a conversation he'd been expecting since the park encounter. "She's lovely, Daniel," Helen said without preamble. "Elegant and kind and clearly smitten with our Sophie." "Helen," Dan said carefully, "Victoria is my boss. This whole situation is complicated enough without reading romantic intentions into friendly dinners. Friendship is where the best love stories begin," Helen replied, with the wisdom of someone who'd been married for 45 years before her husband's death. "And don't think I haven't noticed how you've been smiling more lately." "That's because Sophie's been happier," Dan protested, though he knew it wasn't entirely true. "Sophie's been happier because you've been happier," Helen corrected gently. "Rebecca always said she wanted you to find love again someday. I think she'd approve of Victoria very much." The conversation continued with Helen's gentle probing about Victoria's background and Dan's carefully evasive answers about the complexity of workplace relationships. But as Dan fell asleep that night, he found himself looking forward to Sunday dinner in ways that had nothing to do with Helen's excellent cooking, and everything to do with watching Victoria become part of their family story. Monday morning brought the return to professional reality that Dan had been dreading. Walking into Blackwell Communications after a weekend of personal connection with Victoria felt like entering an alternate universe where they had to pretend Saturday's science project and Sunday's park visit had never happened. Victoria was already in her office when Dan arrived, her blonde hair pulled back in its usual severe style. Wearing a charcoal business suit that transformed her back into the intimidating CEO who commanded boardrooms with icy precision. When their eyes met through her glass office door, she gave him the same polite nod she offered all employees, but Dan caught the slight softening around her eyes that suggested she was working as hard as he was to maintain professional distance. The morning passed with carefully orchestrated normalcy. Dan attended his usual Monday team meeting, reviewed client presentations, and responded to emails with the same competence he'd shown for 3 years. But underneath the routine, he was acutely aware of Victoria's presence in the building, of the strange disconnection between the woman who'd laughed on swings yesterday and the boss who was conducting a budget review meeting with surgical precision. At lunch, Marcus Chen cornered Dan in the break room with the investigative enthusiasm that made him excellent at client relations and terrible at respecting personal boundaries. "So," Marcus said without preamble, settling into the chair across from Dan with his sandwich, "what's the story with you and our beloved Ice Queen?" Dan nearly choked on his coffee. "What are you talking about?" "Please," Marcus scoffed. "Half the office has noticed that Victoria Blackwell has been almost human lately." She smiled during Friday's client presentation. She complimented Sarah's work in front of the entire creative team. She left the office at 6 o'clock last Tuesday instead of working until midnight. "Maybe she's just having a good quarter," Dan suggested weakly. "Nobody has quarters this good," Marcus replied. Plus, Janet from HR mentioned seeing Victoria at the grocery store yesterday morning, buying what looked suspiciously like ingredients for feeding a family. When Janet asked about it, Victoria got all flustered and mentioned something about helping someone special with their family traditions. Dan felt panic rising in his chest. Office gossip traveled at light speed, and the last thing he needed was speculation about his relationship with Victoria affecting either of their professional standing. "You're reading too much into normal behavior," Dan said, trying to keep his voice level. "Maybe Victoria's just learning to maintain better work-life balance." Marcus studied Dan's expression with the analytical skills that made him dangerous in both client negotiations and office gossip. Or maybe she's found someone worth maintaining work-life balance for. Before Dan could respond, Victoria herself appeared in the break room doorway, moving toward the coffee machine with the kind of grace that suggested she was completely unaware of being the subject of speculation. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Victoria said pleasantly, her tone perfectly professional as she prepared her usual afternoon coffee. "Afternoon, Victoria," Marcus replied with exaggerated casualness. "How was your weekend? Do anything interesting?" Dan watched Victoria's hand pause for just a moment on the coffee pot, saw the brief flicker of uncertainty before her professional mask slid back into place. "Just the usual," Victoria said smoothly. "Catching up on paperwork, attending to personal matters. You know how weekends are." "Personal matters?" Marcus murmured with obvious interest. "That sounds wonderfully mysterious." Victoria's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly, and Dan realized that their careful professional distance was actually making their relationship more obvious rather than less. The conversation had been perfectly appropriate, but something about the way Victoria's eyes had lingered on Dan suggested there was more to the story. "I should get back to work," Dan said quickly. "The Morrison presentation needs final review before tomorrow's client meeting." "Of course," Victoria replied, her tone carefully neutral. "Please have it on my desk by 5 o'clock. As Dan left the break room, he caught Marcus watching him with speculative interest. The interaction had been flawlessly professional, but Dan could see the wheels turning behind his colleague's eyes, analyzing every glance and word for signs of hidden meaning. The rest of the week passed with increasing tension as Dan and Victoria worked to maintain professional distance while navigating the growing complexity of their personal connection. Victoria's transformation from intimidating boss to Sophie's beloved friend had created warmth in their professional interactions that was becoming difficult to hide from observant colleagues. Thursday afternoon brought the crisis Dan had been dreading. Victoria's assistant knocked on his cubicle with a request for an immediate meeting in Victoria's office regarding urgent client concerns. Dan found Victoria standing behind her desk with an expression that combined professional concern with personal worry. She waited until he closed the door before speaking. "We need to discuss something that could affect both our careers," she said without preamble. "What's happened?" "Richard Patterson called this morning," Victoria said, referring to one of their most important clients. "He's heard rumors about my personal life that he finds concerning for the stability of our business relationship." Dan felt ice form in his veins. "What kind of rumors? That I'm involved with an employee, that my judgment might be compromised, that perhaps his account should consider agencies with more professional standards." Victoria's voice was carefully controlled, but Dan could hear the fear underneath. The implications hit Dan like a physical blow. Victoria had built her business on reputation and client confidence. Even the suggestion of impropriety could damage relationships she'd spent years cultivating. "I'll transfer to another department," Dan said immediately, "or resign if necessary. It will be a clean separation, and you can honestly say any rumored relationship no longer poses a conflict." "Absolutely not," Victoria said firmly. "You're one of my best employees, and I won't let office gossip cost you your career. Then what do you suggest?" Victoria was quiet for a long moment, staring out her window at the city below. When she spoke, Her voice carried the weight of difficult decisions. "We need to be more careful, more professional, until we figure out how to handle this properly." "What does that mean exactly?" Victoria's next words felt like a door closing between them. "It means no more personal conversations at work, no more lingering glances, no more anything that could be misconstrued as inappropriate professional conduct." Dan understood the logic, but the coldness in her tone made him wonder if she was having second thoughts about their relationship entirely. "And outside of work?" he asked carefully. Victoria's expression softened slightly. "Outside of work, we continue as we have been. But here, we're strictly professional colleagues. What about Sophie? She's expecting you at Grandma Helen's dinner this Sunday." "I'll be there," Victoria said without hesitation. "Nothing will stop me from keeping that promise to her." The conversation ended with uncomfortable formality, and Dan returned to his desk, feeling like they'd somehow lost ground they might never recover. The joy and ease of their developing relationship had been replaced by anxiety and careful calculation that made every interaction feel fraught with potential misunderstanding. Sunday dinner at Helen Morrison's house had always been sacred ground for Dan and Sophie, a weekly ritual that honored Rebecca's memory while providing stability in their uncertain world. As Dan rang the doorbell with Victoria beside him, he felt the weight of crossing an invisible threshold between past and future. Helen opened the door wearing her favorite apron, the one Rebecca had given her for Christmas 3 years ago, and her face lit up when she saw Victoria. If she was surprised by Victoria's stunning appearance in her elegant blue dress and perfectly styled blonde hair, Helen hid it well behind grandmother's warmth. "You must be Victoria," Helen said, immediately pulling her into a hug that Victoria accepted with obvious surprise and growing pleasure. "I'm Helen Morrison, Rebecca's mother and Sophie's most devoted grandmother. Welcome to our home." "Thank you for having me, Mrs. Morrison," Victoria said, offering the bouquet of white roses she'd brought. "Sophie told me these were Rebecca's favorite flowers." Dan felt his breath catch. Victoria had remembered that detail from Sophie's rambling stories, had thought to honor Rebecca's memory in this simple but profound gesture. Helen's eyes filled with tears as she accepted the flowers. "They were indeed. How thoughtful of you to remember." Helen's voice was thick with emotion. "Please, call me Helen. Anyone Sophie adores this much is family." The evening unfolded with surprising ease. Victoria seemed genuinely enchanted by Helen's photo albums, listening intently to stories about Rebecca's childhood and asking questions that showed real interest rather than polite obligation. She admired Sophie's latest artwork displayed on Helen's refrigerator and complimented the grandmother's cooking with such sincere enthusiasm that Helen blushed like a schoolgirl. "Sophie tells me you studied astrophysics," Helen said as they lingered over dessert, her famous apple pie that had been Rebecca's favorite. "What made you switch to marketing?" Victoria's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Life happened," she said quietly. "After my husband died, I needed something that felt concrete, controllable. Business made sense when nothing else did." "But you miss it," Helen observed with grandmother's intuition. "The stars, I mean." "Sometimes," Victoria admitted, glancing at Sophie, who was absorbed in building a tower with her dinner napkin. "Especially on clear nights when I remember how vast and beautiful the universe is." "Miss Victoria knows all the constellations," Sophie announced, abandoning her napkin architecture. "She showed me Orion last week when we went for ice cream after my soccer game." Dan nearly choked on his coffee. Victoria had been to Sophie's soccer game? When had that happened? Seeing his confusion, Victoria smiled sheepishly. "You were stuck in that client emergency meeting Wednesday evening. Sophie mentioned her game, so I offered to pick her up from school and take her. I hope that was okay. You went to a soccer game for 8-year-olds? Helen asked with obvious delight. It was wonderful, Victoria said, her eyes lighting up. Sophie scored 2 goals, and her team won 4-3. Though I may have gotten a little too enthusiastic cheering from the sidelines. She yelled louder than Coach Martinez. Sophie giggled. All the other parents stared, but I liked it. Nobody ever yells just for me except Daddy and Grandma Helen. Dan felt something warm and overwhelming expand in his chest. Victoria had not only attended Sophie's game, but had cheered enthusiastically enough to draw attention, caring more about his daughter's joy than her own professional image. After dinner, Sophie insisted on showing Victoria her latest obsession, a puzzle depicting the solar system that Helen had given her for her birthday. Victoria sat cross-legged on the living room floor in her expensive dress, helping Sophie sort edge pieces while explaining the differences between terrestrial and gas giant planets. Jupiter is my favorite, Sophie declared, holding up a piece that showed the great red spot. It's like a giant protector for all the smaller planets. That's exactly right, Victoria said warmly. Jupiter's gravity pulls in asteroids and comets that might otherwise hit Earth. It really is a protector. Dan watched from the kitchen doorway as Helen joined him with fresh coffee, her expression thoughtful as she observed Victoria and Sophie together. She's not what I expected, Helen said quietly. What did you expect? Someone harder. Colder. Sophie described her as a boss lady, which made me picture someone intimidating. Helen smiled softly. But look at her. She's sitting on my floor in a designer dress, explaining planetary science to an 8-year-old with the same patience I'd expect from a teacher. She's different outside of work, Dan said, still processing how naturally Victoria fit into their family dynamic. There, she's all business, but with Sophie she becomes someone completely different. She becomes herself, Helen finished. The woman she was before she had to build walls to protect herself. They stood in comfortable silence, watching Victoria help Sophie with a particularly challenging puzzle section. When Sophie leaned against Victoria's shoulder to point at a piece, Victoria's arm came around her naturally, as if holding children was something she'd been born to do. Daniel, Helen said carefully, how do you feel about her? The question Dan had been avoiding crystallized in the warmth of Helen's kitchen, surrounded by the sounds of Victoria and Sophie's laughter from the living room. Terrified, he admitted, but also hopeful in a way I haven't been since Rebecca died. When I'm with Victoria, I remember what it feels like to be part of a team instead of just surviving alone. And the guilt? Dan had known Helen would understand. She'd loved Rebecca like her own daughter, but had also watched Dan struggle with the isolation of single parenthood for 2 years. It's there, Dan said honestly, but less than I expected. Rebecca always said she wanted Sophie and me to be happy. I think she'd approve of Victoria. I know she would, Helen said firmly. Rebecca's gift was seeing the good in people, and she would have seen immediately what I see in Victoria tonight, which is a woman who's found her way home. The evening ended with Sophie falling asleep during a nature documentary, curled against Victoria's side on Helen's old sofa. Victoria made no move to disturb her, seeming content to serve as a human pillow while Dan and Helen cleaned up in the kitchen. I should get her to bed, Dan said softly when they returned to find both girls peacefully sleeping, Sophie's head on Victoria's lap, while Victoria's hand rested protectively in the child's auburn hair. 5 more minutes, Victoria whispered. She feels so perfect like this. Something in her tone made Dan look more closely. Victoria's eyes were bright with unshed tears, her expression tender and wondering, as she gazed down at his sleeping daughter. Victoria, are you okay? I'm perfect, she said softly. For the first time in years, everything feels perfect. When they finally transferred Sophie to Dan's car, she barely stirred, mumbling sleepily about wanting Victoria to come to breakfast tomorrow. As they stood in Helen's driveway saying goodbye, Victoria turned to the older woman with genuine emotion. "Thank you for welcoming me into your family tradition," Victoria said. "This was the best Sunday I've had since my husband died." "Nonsense," Helen replied, pulling Victoria into another fierce hug. "You're welcome here any time. In fact, I insist you come back next week. Someone needs to help me eat all this food." As they drove home, Sophie's soft snores from the back seat, Victoria reached over and took Dan's hand. Her fingers were warm and slightly trembling. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For letting me belong somewhere again. For sharing your family with someone who'd forgotten what family felt like." Dan squeezed her hand, his heart full of emotions too complex to name. "Thank you for showing us what joy looks like again." 3 weeks later, Sunday dinners with Helen had become their new normal. Victoria brought flowers each week, different varieties but always Rebecca's favorites, and Helen had taken to cooking enough food to guarantee leftovers for Victoria's solitary weekday meals. The transformation in Sophie was remarkable. The quiet sadness that had shadowed her since Rebecca's death was gradually being replaced by confidence and joy. She chatted constantly about Victoria's visits, her soccer games where Victoria cheered louder than any other parent, their after-school adventures that ranged from museum visits to ice cream expeditions to quiet homework sessions at Victoria's apartment. "Miss Victoria has a telescope on her balcony," Sophie announced during one dinner, barely pausing between bites of Helen's famous meatloaf. "She's teaching me about galaxies and black holes and nebula. Did you know some stars are so far away that their light takes millions of years to reach us?" "I did not know that," Helen said solemnly, though her eyes twinkled with amusement at Sophie's earnest excitement. "It means we're seeing them as they were millions of years ago," Sophie continued importantly. "Miss Victoria says it's like looking into the past every time we look at the sky." Dan watched Victoria's face during these dinner conversations, saw how she glowed under Sophie's enthusiastic attention, how she encouraged every question and celebrated every small understanding. Victoria was teaching his daughter that learning was an adventure, that curiosity was something to be nurtured rather than managed. But it was the quieter moments that revealed the depth of Victoria's integration into their lives. The way she automatically cut Sophie's meat into smaller pieces, knew without asking that Sophie preferred her vegetables separate from her mashed potatoes, remembered that Thursday was library day, and Friday was show and tell. Victoria was learning to love Sophie in all the small daily ways that built real relationships. After one particularly perfect Sunday, when Sophie had fallen asleep between them during a movie, Victoria turned to Dan with an expression that was both vulnerable and determined. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly, careful not to wake Sophie. "What is it?" "I'm falling in love with this," Victoria said, gesturing to encompass their cozy domestic scene. "With these dinners and soccer games and homework help and all the beautiful chaos that comes with loving a child. But mostly I'm falling in love with you." Dan's heart stopped. "Victoria," he started. "I know it's complicated," she continued quickly. "I know there are a million practical considerations and office policies and ways this could go wrong. But I also know that for the first time in 4 years, I wake up excited about something other than quarterly reports." Dan reached for her hand, threading their fingers together. "I'm falling in love with you too," he admitted. "With the woman who cheers at soccer games and explains constellations and makes my daughter light up like Christmas morning." They sat in the soft glow of Helen's living room, holding hands while Sophie slept peacefully between them, and Dan realized that love didn't always arrive with fanfare and dramatic gestures. Sometimes it grew quietly in Sunday dinners and shared laughter, in small kindnesses and daily presence. Sometimes it felt like coming home. But their growing happiness was about to face its greatest test. Because love stories that begin with accidental text messages and develop through corporate hierarchies don't get to avoid the complications that come with mixing professional and personal lives. And Victoria was about to discover just how much she was willing to sacrifice for the family she'd never expected to find. The crisis came on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after Victoria had become a regular fixture in Dan and Sophie's life. Dan arrived at work to find the office buzzing with an energy that felt different from usual Monday motivation. Conversation stopped when he passed, and he caught several co-workers exchanging meaningful glances when they thought he wasn't looking. Tom Morrison, the company's senior partner and Victoria's longtime mentor, was waiting in Dan's cubicle with an expression that suggested this conversation wouldn't be pleasant. "Mr. Carter," Tom said without preamble, "I need you in the conference room in 10 minutes. Bring your current project files and any personal items from your workspace." Dan's stomach dropped. That language typically preceded termination meetings. "Is there a problem with my work?" "We'll discuss everything in the conference room," Tom replied, his tone suggesting the conversation was over. The meeting was every bit as uncomfortable as Dan had feared. Tom Morrison sat at the head of the polished conference table with Janet from HR and 2 board members Dan barely recognized. Victoria was nowhere to be seen. "Mr. Carter," Tom began, "it's come to our attention that there may be a personal relationship between you and senior management that creates potential conflicts of interest." Dan felt the walls closing in around him. The office gossip had finally reached the executive level, and now his career and Victoria's reputation were both at risk. "What exactly are you alleging?" Dan asked. "We're not alleging anything," Janet from HR interjected smoothly. "We're simply clarifying company policy regarding relationships between supervisors and direct reports. There are established protocols for addressing these situations," Tom continued. "Transfer to another department, reassignment of supervisory responsibilities, or, if necessary, employment termination." "Are you firing me?" Dan asked directly. "We're offering solutions," Tom replied. "None of which need to be implemented if there's no conflict of interest to address." Dan realized they were being asked to either deny their relationship or face professional consequences that could destroy everything Victoria had worked to build. "Where is Victoria in this conversation?" Dan asked. "Shouldn't she be part of any discussion that affects her professional standing?" "Ms. Blackwell has already been informed of our concerns," Tom said carefully. "She's requested time to consider the best path forward for all parties involved." Dan felt betrayed and confused. Victoria had agreed to this meeting without him? Had she decided their relationship wasn't worth fighting for? "I need to speak with Victoria directly," Dan said. "That's not possible right now," Tom replied. "We need your answer by Friday. Either confirm that there's no inappropriate relationship to address, or we'll implement the necessary protocol changes." Dan left the meeting feeling like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. Everything he and Victoria had built together, every moment of connection and growing love, was being threatened by corporate policies that reduced human relationships to liability management. But Dan didn't know that Victoria was at that very moment in her own office, staring at a resignation letter she'd been writing since dawn. She'd been given the same ultimatum, told that her relationship with Dan was jeopardizing client confidence and company stability. Victoria had built her business from nothing, sacrificed personal happiness for professional success, created an agency that reflected her vision and values. But sitting in her office, Looking at family photos from recent Sunday dinners that had appeared on her desk without her quite realizing it, Victoria made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to choose between her career and her family again. She'd made that mistake once, prioritizing work over love when James had begged her to take time off, to focus on their marriage, to build a life together instead of just parallel careers. She wouldn't lose Dan and Sophie the way she'd lost James, to corporate demands that treated love like weakness and family like distraction. Victoria picked up her phone and sent a text to Dan. "Meet me at our park tonight after Sophie's bedtime. There's something I need to tell you." That evening, Dan found Victoria sitting on the bench where they'd spent their first afternoon together months earlier. She looked different, somehow lighter despite the serious expression on her face. "Victoria," he began, but she held up a hand. "Let me go first," she said. "I've been thinking about what Tom Morrison and the board are really asking us to do. They want us to choose between our professional obligations and our personal happiness. Decide whether love is worth the risk of losing everything we've worked for." Dan's heart sank. She was going to choose her career. He couldn't blame her, but the disappointment was crushing. "I have my answer," Victoria continued, pulling an envelope from her purse. "I resigned this morning." Dan stared at her, certain he'd misheard. "You what?" "I quit," Victoria said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I refuse to work for people who think loving you and Sophie is a liability instead of the best thing that's ever happened to me." "Victoria, you can't sacrifice your career for us. You've worked too hard, built too much." "I'm not sacrificing anything," Victoria said firmly. "I'm choosing what matters. I spent 4 years hiding behind professional success because it felt safer than risking my heart again. I won't go back to that, Dan. I won't lose you and Sophie because some board members are afraid of office gossip. But your business, everything you've built, will survive just fine without me, or it will give me the opportunity to build something better." Victoria's eyes were bright with tears and determination. "Marcus has already agreed to come with me. So have Sarah and 3 other designers. We're starting our own agency, one that values family as much as profit margins." Dan felt his world tilt as the implications sank in. Victoria was risking everything she'd built, betting her professional future on their relationship. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "Really sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Victoria said, reaching for his hands. "I love you, Dan. I love Sophie like she's my own daughter. I want to build a life with you that doesn't require us to hide or apologize for caring about each other." Before Dan could respond, his phone buzzed with a text message from Sophie, who was supposedly asleep at Helen's house for the evening. "Daddy, did you ask Miss Victoria to marry us yet? Grandma Helen says you should hurry up before someone else does." Victoria laughed through her tears as Dan showed her the message. "I think our daughter has some opinions about our timeline." "Our daughter," Dan repeated, loving the way those words sounded. "Victoria, I love you too. I love you enough to support whatever decision you make, even if it means leaving Seattle for better opportunities. We're not going anywhere." Victoria said firmly, "This is our home. These are our people. We're going to build something beautiful right here." 6 months later, Second Chances Creative occupied a bright, modern office space in a renovated warehouse downtown. The walls were covered with award-winning campaigns, client testimonials, and photos from company events that included families and children. It was everything Victoria had envisioned: successful, innovative, and genuinely supportive of work-life balance. The agency had exceeded all expectations. 5 of Blackwell Communications' major clients had followed Victoria, attracted by her vision of marketing that prioritized authentic human connection. The team of 12 employees worked collaboratively in an open environment where Victoria's leadership style had evolved from intimidating authority to inspiring mentorship. Dan's role as creative director had allowed him to flourish in ways his old position never permitted. His campaigns for local non-profits and family-owned businesses had won regional recognition, and his work schedule gave him flexibility to be present for Sophie's school events and daily needs. But the most remarkable transformation was in their family dynamic. Victoria had essentially moved into Dan and Sophie's house, though she maintained her apartment for the sake of appearances. Most evenings found her helping with homework while Dan cooked dinner, and most mornings began with the three of them sharing breakfast before starting their respective days. Sophie had thrived under the attention of two adults who both prioritized her well-being. Her grades improved, her confidence soared, and she'd started talking about Victoria as Mommy. Victoria in a way that felt natural rather than forced. One evening in early spring, as Victoria was putting Sophie to bed while Dan cleaned up dinner dishes, Sophie asked the question that would change everything. "Mummy Victoria," she said seriously, "when are you and Daddy getting married for real?" Victoria's heart stuttered. "We haven't really talked about that yet, sweetheart. But you love each other, right? And we're already a family. So when do we make it official?" Victoria tucked the blankets around Sophie's shoulders, marveling at 8-year-old logic that cut straight to the heart of complex adult emotions. "What would you think about that?" Victoria asked. "If Daddy and I got married?" "I think it would be the best thing ever," Sophie said solemnly. "Then you'd really be my mommy, and we'd really be a forever family." That night, as Victoria and Dan sat on their back porch, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the stars emerge in the clear sky, Victoria brought up Sophie's question. "She wants to know when we're getting married," Victoria said with a smile. "Apparently our timeline is too slow for her taste." Dan set down his wine glass and turned to face Victoria fully. "What did you tell her?" "That we haven't talked about it yet." "But Dan, I want to talk about it. I want to marry you. I want to adopt Sophie legally and officially become her mother. I want us to be a real family in every sense of the word." Dan's smile was radiant in the porch light. "I want that too. I've wanted it for months, but wasn't sure if you were ready for that kind of commitment." Victoria reached for his hands, threading their fingers together with the gesture that had become second nature to them both. "I'm ready for everything," she said. "Marriage, family, the whole beautiful, chaotic adventure of building a life together." Dan pulled her closer, kissing her with all the love and gratitude and hope that had been building since that first accidental text message. "Will you marry me, Victoria Blackwell?" he whispered against her lips. "Will you be Sophie's mother and my wife and the center of our family?" "Yes," Victoria whispered back. "Yes to all of it. Forever and always, yes." From inside the house came the sound of 8-year-old feet hitting the floor as Sophie snuck to her bedroom window to eavesdrop on the conversation she'd been hoping to hear for months. The wedding took place 6 months later in the botanical gardens where Sophie loved to explore, surrounded by friends and colleagues from Second Chances Creative and Helen Morrison, who served as both grandmother of the bride and keeper of Rebecca's blessing on their union. Victoria wore a simple ivory dress that accommodated the small but growing bump that announced their newest family member would arrive in early spring. The baby had been a surprise, a gift that seemed to confirm the universe approved of their choices. Sophie served as maid of honor, taking her responsibilities seriously and declaring to anyone who would listen that she was getting both a new mommy and a new baby sibling, which made her the luckiest kid in the entire world. As Victoria walked down the aisle toward Dan, she thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. 2 years earlier, she'd been a lonely workaholic who'd convinced herself professional success was enough. Dan had been a struggling single father going through the motions of survival. Now they were a family, choosing each other intentionally and joyfully, building something beautiful from the broken pieces of their individual losses. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, their kiss was witnessed by everyone who mattered, including Helen Morrison, who whispered to herself that Rebecca would be so proud of the love they'd found. The reception was held in the same gardens, with dancing under string lights and toasts that celebrated not just their marriage, but the courage it took to choose love over safety, family over convenience, hope over fear. Marcus gave a speech that had everyone laughing about the office gossip that had started it all, crediting his investigative skills with bringing them together. Helen spoke about the beauty of watching broken hearts learn to heal. Sophie gave her own toast, declaring that fairy tales were real, and sometimes they started with daddies who forgot how to use their phones properly. As the evening wound down and they prepared to leave for their honeymoon, a weekend at the coast that accommodated Victoria's pregnancy and Sophie's schedule, Victoria found herself overwhelmed by gratitude for the life they'd built together. "Thank you," she said to Dan as they swayed together on the makeshift dance floor, Sophie asleep in Helen's arms nearby. "For what? For sending that text message. For being brave enough to let me into your life. For giving me a family when I thought I'd lost my chance at that kind of happiness." "Thank you for responding," Dan replied, his hand resting protectively on her growing belly. "For showing up when you could have just handled it, professionally. For loving Sophie and me enough to risk everything you'd built." "Sometimes," Victoria said, looking around at their friends and family celebrating their happiness. "The best things in life begin with accidents that lead us exactly where we need to be." 3 years later, their house was filled with the beautiful chaos of a complete family. Baby James toddled between his big sister Sophie and his parents, chattering in a mix of words and babble that had everyone convinced he was destined for advanced verbal skills. Sophie, now 11 and wise beyond her years, had fully embraced her role as big sister and helper, teaching James about planets and dinosaurs with the same patience Victoria had once shown her with science projects. Second Chance's Creative had grown into one of the most respected agencies in the Pacific Northwest, known not just for excellent work, but for innovative approaches to work-life balance that had been featured in business magazines as a model for the future of professional environments. Dan and Victoria had found their rhythm as both business partners and spouses, supporting each other's professional growth while prioritizing their family's needs. They'd learned that love didn't require sacrifice when it was built on mutual respect and shared values. But the most beautiful part of their story wasn't the professional success or even the personal happiness. It was the way they'd created a family that honored the past while embracing the future, that made room for Rebecca's memory while celebrating Victoria's place in their lives. Every Sunday dinner at Helen's house included stories about Rebecca that kept her alive in Sophie's memory and expressions of gratitude for Victoria's love that made everyone feel blessed rather than guilty about their happiness. On a quiet evening in late spring, as Victoria nursed baby James while watching Dan help Sophie with homework and listening to 11-year-old chatter about middle school preparations, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Sometimes the most important messages in our lives are the ones we never meant to send, she thought, remembering that late-night text that had started everything. But it wasn't really about the accident, Victoria realized. It was about the choice to respond with kindness instead of professional distance. The choice to show up on Saturday morning with coffee and help, the choice to keep showing up day after day, building trust and love through small acts of care and presence. Dan looked up from Sophie's math homework and caught Victoria's expression, reading her thoughts with the intuition that came from years of partnership. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. How grateful I am for accidental text messages that lead to intentional families. Victoria replied, shifting James to her shoulder for burping, while Sophie announced she'd finally mastered long division. Best accident ever, Dan agreed, moving to kiss Victoria's forehead, while Sophie rolled her eyes at their constant displays of affection. As their family settled into evening routines, with James falling asleep to Sophie's gentle singing, and Victoria and Dan cleaning up the remnants of another chaotic but perfect day, Victoria felt the deep contentment that came from living authentically. They'd built something real together, something that honored their individual losses while celebrating their collective gains, something that proved love could triumph over fear, family could triumph over convenience, and sometimes the greatest gifts came disguised as mistakes that led us exactly where we needed to be. And every night, as Victoria fell asleep beside Dan, with their children safe and happy under the same roof, she whispered a silent thank you to the universe for wrong numbers that turned into right answers, for lonely hearts that found each other in the darkness, and for the beautiful truth that it's never too late to begin again when you're brave enough to let love in. If this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, if it reminded you that second chances exist and that love can find us in the most unexpected ways, please don't let it end here. Hit that like button if you believe in the power of accidental moments that change everything. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about ordinary people who discovered that extraordinary love was just one brave choice away. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that their story isn't over, that new chapters are waiting to be written, and that sometimes the best families are the ones we choose rather than the ones we're born into. And remember, whether you're sending late-night texts or receiving unexpected kindness, every moment is a chance to choose connection over isolation, hope over fear, and love over safety. Your perfect family might be just one accidental message away from finding you. Thanks for watching, and remember that miracles often wear the disguise of ordinary Tuesday afternoons when lonely hearts decide to be brave enough to reach out and let someone else reach back.